Very good morning, I am Shilpa. Welcome you all to the NCERT live phone-in program. And our today's topic of discussion is Quit India Movement. That means Bharat Chodo Andolan. And to discuss further, in the studio we have Professor Pratyusa Kumar Mandal, who is designated as a professor and head at International Relation Division in NCERT. I welcome you, sir, on today's show.
Thank you very much.
So let's proceed to discuss our today's topic of discussion. But before we proceed, I would like to tell you is that our today's episode is in the continuation of our previous one, which was on the civil disobedience movement, which you can find on our YouTube channel named as NCERT Official. So sir, today we are discussing about Quit India movement. But before we proceed, it's important to understand the perspective of that time.
Yes, you are right. Our audience would recollect that last time we had discussed the Swadeshi movement and also the non-cooperation movement before we proceeded to discuss the civil disobedience movement.
Right.
So similarly, in that chain of our understanding of India's movements for freedom, we need also to bear in mind certain developments of that particular time. It's important in order to put the Quit India movement in real historical perspective. The first thing that we have to bear in mind is that there were different social groups and classes who had come to join the mass movements which had been launched during the first half of the 20th century, that is from 1900 to about, that is from 1900 onwards, which had been launched under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi. So now, if we take note of certain things, we would realize that Mahatma Gandhi and the Indian National Congress as an institution were trying to build some kind of a national unity by identifying the commonalities in the aspirations and grievances of different social groups and classes who were joining these mass movements. Second important thing that we have to understand is that because different social groups and classes had different aspirations and grievances, so they had naturally different expectations from these movements. Many times these different expectations had also become causes for disunity. So it is ironical, because the Indian National Congress and Mahatma Gandhi were trying to forge unity among different social segments, but because of the differing expectations among social segments, these were becoming the reasons for disunity also. So, whereas different movements were leading India's struggle towards freedom, the objectives of these movements were also not getting fulfilled 100%. So, one can say that the movements were haltingly proceeding from one to the other, like from the Swadeshi movement to the non-cooperation movement, from the non-cooperation movement to the civil disobedience movement, and then to the Quit India movement. So this was happening each time, having two consequences. One important consequence was that they were definitely taking India towards achieving the goal of freedom, one step at a time. But at the same time, they were also failing to achieve fully the objectives of each of these movements. So, from a historical perspective, it is important for us to understand that India's national movement was mostly a process. So it was not one movement, full achievement of its goals, and the realization of the ultimate objective of Swaraj.
Okay.
Yes.
So, as we all have read that in 1934, civil disobedience movement has like completely died out. But when was the Quit India movement was lost?
Yes, because there always comes some kind of a grey zone between the petering out of one movement and the beginning of another movement.
Right, sir.
So mostly students of Indian history find these grey zones slightly difficult to comprehend. So to put it in a perspective, I would like to state that there were important events which we may focus on, like the Congress Working Committee, for example, met at Wardha in July 14, 1942, and it passed a long resolution which is called the Quit India Resolution.
Okay.
So now passing of this resolution may not be considered as the date for the commencement of the movement.
Right.
The All India Congress Committee, which is popularly called even today AICC, so every student must be aware of this, which met in Bombay on 7th August 1942,
Okay.
ratified this resolution. And it ratified this resolution with overwhelming majority. So we can technically say that 7th August 1942 is the date when this movement was formally launched.
Okay.
So today, the place in Bombay where the AICC met and ratified this resolution has come to be popularly called as the August Kranti Maidan in Mumbai. So this is an interesting thing for the students of history also to remember.
So there are other mass movements like non-cooperation and civil disobedience. So how this was categorized under that?
Yes. The nomenclatures for these movements also have their own historical contexts.
Okay.
Like the non-cooperation movement is called non-cooperation movement because while launching this movement, the Congress appealed to the people not to cooperate with the foreign government. As early as 1909, Mahatma Gandhi had recorded his own reflections on the reasons why the British colonialism had achieved success in India. And while recording his resolution in this what later published as a book with the title Hind Swaraj, he had said that the British had established their rule in India with the cooperation of the Indians, and it was surviving and thriving with the cooperation of the Indians. So logically it follows from this premise that if Indians withdraw this cooperation from the British, then the British regime would collapse. So when the time was considered to be ripe in 1920-22 period, the movement that was launched was called non-cooperation movement.
Okay.
The people were asked not to cooperate with the foreign government in any manner possible. So the people returned the awards which the British government had given. Many times students of history would realize that the governments give awards in order to make themselves legitimate in the eyes of the people, and also to co-opt important people who would in turn help these colonial governments become legitimate in the eyes of the rest of the people. So awards were returned. Then people did not go to institutions like colleges, schools and courts established by the government. So a kind of movement started among the people to establish their own institutions. So this was a positive step towards having Swaraj. Now civil disobedience movement was the next logical step. It was called civil disobedience because people were asked to actively disobey any kind of rule that was passed by the foreign government. Because we have to understand that when rules reflect or laws reflect people's will, then it becomes easier for people to adhere to these laws or obey those laws. But a foreign government was mostly passing laws which were unjust because of the fact that these laws were formulated based on what were the interest of the foreign government, not what were the interest of the people,
right,
of India. That's why civil disobedience movement asked the people to actively disobey the laws. And now Quit India movement is because now the situation has come to such a pass that it became very difficult for India's nationalist leadership, including Mahatma Gandhi, to further see any relevance of the foreign government in India. So that's why they asked the foreign government either to leave India or leave it to anarchy. So that is how all the movements acquired their nomenclatures, which also for the students of history makes qualitative difference between them. But what is more important for us to remember here is that all these movements had a logical sequence. Each succeeding movement built on the premises and achievements of the preceding movement.
So it was so interesting to know the story behind its the nomenclature. So you mentioned about the Quit India resolution.
Yes.
So what did the Quit India resolution read? Because that will be helpful for us to know.
Yeah, it's really instructive for us to know the resolution, because the resolution also reflects the reasons why the Quit India movement was launched. As I said, this is a wrong resolution, so instead of reading it wholly, I would like to emphasize on its key features and key phrases. So that would in a sense make us understand what subsequently Gandhiji in a speech said about the Quit India resolution. He said, and I read now, every one of you should from this moment onwards consider yourself a free man or woman and act as if you are free. I am not going to be satisfied with anything short of freedom. We shall do or die. We shall either free India or die in the attempt. Thus, do or die, karo ya maro, came to be considered as the watchword of this movement. Watchword means mantra.
Right.
Sometimes we call it a mantra. So the resolution, after which Mahatma Gandhi delivered this particular speech, reasserted the earlier demand that the British rule in India must end immediately. Second, it also pointed out that the freedom of India was not only in the interest of India, but also in the interest of the British government itself. because it was after all going to fight the war for democracy. The Second World War, I mean. And the third thing, it also said that was it not a fact that the United Nations, which was in the offing, was also harping on this issue of freedom of nations. So the resolution was highlighting all these three important points of that time. First it said India must be free. Second it said why it is in the interest of both the Indians as well as the British. Third it said why it is in the interest of the development that were taking place in the world in general. The United Nations had come to this understanding that freedom was a necessary inalienable condition for nations to fight for democracy and also sustain it. So
next, the role of Indian National Congress. So what kind of a strategy Indian National Congress actually adopt to launch this movement?
We have seen in earlier movements the kind of strategy that the Indian National Congress adopted. In all the movements, if we look back, then we will see that there were two sides. One was obviously what we already explained in case of non-cooperation, not to cooperate with the British. But non-cooperation need not be understood, or should not rather be understood as only a negative way of launching a movement. It had a constructive side to it. The constructive side is, if not going to a school established by the British or the foreign government, or at least sanctioned by it or recognized by it, then what else to do? Should the children not study? So now the constructive side of this is set up your own school. So when these kind of constructive approaches happened, then we had great institutions coming up in our country. Great understandings also came up. What kind of education do we require? Say for example, so Mahatma Gandhi spoke about basic education. No, learning while doing. It is of course a matter of concern that so many decades after India's independence, we have not actually been able to realize the dream of Gandhiji, or rather the philosophy which he actually put into practice. So similarly, in case of civil disobedience movement, there was a strategy which had two sides of it. One was willingly defy the laws that were passed by the British, but also to have certain laws for yourself. How do you channelize yourself? Many of the important leaders of the time, like Sardar Patel, they have stated very frequently that for us, the laws of the struggle, the laws of Satyagraha and the laws of Gandhi were more important than any of these laws that were being framed by the British. So civil disobedience movement did not imply having a lawless society or lawless system in place. So similarly, this Quit India movement also had a strategy behind it.
So I have got a question here, sir. We have got a question from Sakshi, and she wants to understand this movement was overall in an unique movement because the role of women in this movement. Please discuss on that.
See, the role of women was there from the very beginning. What made the Gandhian movements so special, and what makes us call it mass movement, is not simply because different social groups and classes were coming forth to participate in it. But also, these movements for the first time made the people of India realize that no national goal, leave alone the question of freedom for the country, can be achieved without harnessing the full participation of half of its population, that's the women. So, Mahatma Gandhi ensured that in all these movements, the women of India come forward and take part. And it is with this intention that different initiatives were taken. And we have seen during civil disobedience movement how even children were coming forward to take part.
Right.
They were considering themselves as the Banar Sena. This would not have happened if women would not have come forward to take part. It provided great incentive for everyone to think about women education. It provided great incentive to make everyone think about women joining different professions, say for example medical profession. It also led everyone to realize that India's subservience to the British rule was on account of its economic deprivation, which can be alleviated only with the participation of the women in economic enterprise. So, all of these things could happen because of these movements, and these movements, as it were, opened the floodgates for both the genders, the men and women, to come together and work hand in hand. And ultimately it led to India realizing its goal of Purna Swaraj.
Okay.
Yeah.
I hope, Sakshi, you have got the answer of your question. So, one question is just coming in my mind, which is, what moved Gandhiji and Indian National Congress to launch the Quit India movement?
It's very important for us to understand the kind of events that were happening. But before I explain that, let me complete what earlier I was talking about the strategy that was adopted by the Indian National Congress in launching this movement. One strategy was very clear. That was that this movement must be launched under the careful guidance of Mahatma Gandhi. And that's how it makes all these movements, starting from non-cooperation movement down to Quit India movement, Gandhian movements. The historians call these movements as Gandhian movements because of this thing. The second thing was that the Indian National Congress had realized from its experience in conducting earlier movements that the British could target Gandhi and take him to prison. So what will happen then? The movement becomes kind of leaderless, rudderless. So in this instance, they well prepared for it and passed guidelines in no uncertain terms. So for example, the All India Congress Committee, as I said, it's even now popularly called AICC. It stated, and I read this: when this happens, when Gandhiji is taken into prison, every man and woman who is participating in the movement must function for himself or herself within the four corners of the general instructions issued. And these are principles of Satyagraha. You should not be violating them. Every Indian who desires freedom and strives for it must be his own guide, urging him or her on a long, hard road where there is no resting place, and which leads ultimately to the independence and deliverance of India. Talked about 2-3 things. One, when the leader of the movement, Gandhiji, is not there, you should be in charge of yourself. 2, you should conduct yourself within the framework of the guidelines which have been given to you. 3, you must know that it's a hard, long struggle. You will suffer in untold ways, if possible. You should have the forbearance to withstand all of that, because the ultimate goal is the deliverance of India from foreign rule. So that's why it is do or die. Now, coming to the question that you raised now, we have to now see that during this, in between the cessation of the civil disobedience movement and the launching of the Quit India movement, many important events had taken place. One of these was the passing of the Government of India Act of 1935.
Okay.
So, now 2 important features of the Government of India Act. One was that it now talked about a federal structure at the center, that there would be a federal government, and 2, it will have provinces. So there were clearly 11 provinces.
Okay.
Now, earlier constitutional reforms had brought in diarchy. Diarchy means the elected governments will have certain powers and domains for the exercise of their powers, and the Governor General, who is the representative of the foreign government in India, will have certain domains of power and which will be unique. So, 2 authorities, some kind. This had led to the non-functional system, crippling Indian governance most of the time. So, here in this context, diarchy was removed from the provinces.
Okay.
So, almost kind of direct responsible government, but not at the center. Whatever it is, the Government of India Act 1935 ensured that there would be now governments which would be popularly elected for provincial assemblies. So, the elections were held under this act in January, February 1937. The Indian National Congress framed its ministries in several provinces: United Provinces, Central Provinces, Odisha, Bihar, Madras, Bombay, Assam, and the Northwest Frontier Province. So these were the provinces where the Congress formed its government. In Punjab and Bengal, the Muslim League came to form its ministries. During the 2 years of their existence, these provincial governments formed by the Congress demonstrated 2 things. One, it demonstrated that Congress is not only good in leading mass agitations against foreign rule, but it was equally good in using state power if given an opportunity for the welfare of the people.
Right.
It demonstrated that what the earlier constitutional reforms and mechanisms had not delivered, now the Congress governments could deliver. So, there was another thing which also happened during this period. These were called the Mandal movements.
Okay.
There were about 600 princely states in India at the time. In all these states, which were outside of the direct administration of the British, the kings used to be the arbiters of all decisions, Now, people wanted to say that if the British administered territories were moving towards having popular governments, why not the princely states? So, thus this movement was happening under the guidance of the All India States People's Conference. And the third thing that was happening was the rise of extreme communalism. Extreme communalism. The Muslim League was slowly inching towards its two-nation theory and demand for Pakistan. And the British government was going extra mile to appease these kinds of demands. Cripps Mission's proposals were one such thing. And next, the people suffering from acute price rise and shortage of food because of the Second World War, new taxation, and Japan's victories coming almost up to the door steps of India, made Gandhiji said to the British to leave India in God's hands, or in modern parlance, to anarchy.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that was wonderful to know about the Quit India movement in depth today by Professor Kumar Mandal. Though there is a few things also left which we can cover in our next episode with the Professor Kumar Mandal only. So if you have any query or the question if you may want to ask related to our today's episode, then you can dial into our toll-free number or can drop an email to us. Till then, take care and keep watching Kishore Manch.